Okay, it's 2:05 on my clock, so we'll go ahead and get started if that's okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It is great to see so many familiar faces and to welcome a lot of new friends I'm seeing here today as well. My name is Cindy Seaton Rogers, and I'm the president of the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, but I'm also the academic and outreach events manager at the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas at Dallas, which is where I have the privilege of studying with and working for our guest today, Dr. Nils Roemer. Before I do introduce him, though, I would like to go over just a couple of quick housekeeping items. Please make sure that you're muted and that you stay muted throughout the event. It'll also be helpful if you go ahead and stop sharing your video so that we can maximize the quality of the video feed. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the lecture. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat and we'll address as many of those as we can at the end. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nils Roemer, who is the interim dean of the School of the Arts and Humanities, the director of the Ackerman Center, and the Stan and Barbara Rabin Professor in Holocaust Studies at UT Dallas. He received in 1993 his MA from the University of Hamburg, and in 2000 his PhD from Columbia University. He has published numerous articles, books, and several co-edited volumes, and he is also the co-editor of the Germanic Review. His special fields of interest are the Holocaust, human rights, and German and Jewish cultural and intellectual history. Today he'll be presenting a special lecture on the Sephardic Jews in the Third Reich. Dr. Roemer?
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for having me. Can you all hear me okay? This is where you hopefully not, okay? Just checking the good old audio. Let me just share my screen. Let's play from start, right? You can see a big picture of me?
Yes, sir.
All righty, then we're good to go. So thank you, first of all, for having me today here. I'm really thrilled to lecture about this topic and obviously also to get to know you all a little bit more, as much as one can on these video calls of sorts. Before I do so, let me just, Cindy was already kind enough to introduce me. Let me just say a few words just quickly about the center. It all began many, many years ago in the 1980s with the arrival of our very esteemed colleague and founding director, Professor Zsuzsanna Oswald, who arrived at UT Dallas and started teaching almost upon her arrival, also outside of the classes on literature, also on the Holocaust. This was based on her own experience. She is a Holocaust survivor from Budapest. But her initial beginnings then very quickly resulted already in the start of Holocaust Studies program, and then eventually in the creation 2006 of the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies Center that we have today. And that today is quite formidable in its size. Here's a list of our faculty. You see me on top of the list, and then obviously my esteemed colleague, Professor Patterson, very new hire this year. We're thrilled. We hired Professor Amy Kerner, who has expertise of thinking about the Holocaust within the context of its survivors and its memories in Latin America. And then Professor Pfister and our two very distinguished visiting assistant professors who also have a focus on Latin America, Professor Gonzalez Corona and also Professor Valente. So by now, in other words, this center has quite come into its own at a university that is just about 50 years old. And therefore, we're kind of still very much young in heart, but we feel that we've kind of grown over the years quite a bit. All right, I want us now to spend a little bit of time of thinking about our topic and the way I would like to address it. I think the starting point to thinking about the Sephardim and the Holocaust has got to be always to think about the fact that in general, the Holocaust is often perceived to be an event that affected only Ashkenazic Jews. I mean, just in terms of sheer numbers, when we think about the Holocaust, the images that most often we associate with it is rather Ashkenazic Jews than Sephardic Jews. And that has, unfortunately resulted in a lack of studies on this subject, and has also often led really to an exclusion of the experience of Jews on the Balkans, as well as the Jews of North Africa. Now, lately, this has gotten a little bit better, and I'm just introducing here a book that has just come out now in October, The Sephardim and the Holocaust, A Forgotten People. But I think the title itself still is indicative of the fact that here's a history and experience of the Holocaust that hitherto had not been addressed appropriately, and that has to be now made more publicly visible. And so I want to talk about that visibility or lack thereof for just a bit, and then introduce how I intend to talk about the Sephardim and the Holocaust in the next 25 to 30 minutes. So let me just move to my next slide here. So why are possibly Sephardic Jews excluded largely, just in terms of the visibility from what we otherwise might call the history of the Holocaust? And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, for starters, we start to understand the Holocaust as a European event. And the moment we say that it's a European event, we've already narrowed the geography quite significantly. And if you think about it, that Europe might still be inclusive, let's say, of Italy and of Greece, and obviously it is, it nonetheless, I think, has always a tendency of centering what we're looking at, even more so, let's say, on France and Germany and that kind of territory. So the very ways by which we think about the Holocaust as a European event has already a potential of excluding at least the experience of Jews from North Africa, I would argue. The way we visualize the Holocaust, if we want to just quickly, come to terms with its wider scale, also tends to be centered, not surprisingly, on the death camps and on the slave labor camps, and in particular on the kind of northeastern geography, which leaves very little space in that picture for anything more southern, and no space whatsoever, I think, for North Africa. Here you have another version of this. I think that is equally true, not just for the way we study the Holocaust, but also for the way we most often commemorate the Holocaust. Most of the larger Holocaust memorials and museums tend to focus, again, the Holocaust on this particular geography that highlights and elevates the experience of the Ashkenazim and focuses our attention, let's say, on France, Netherlands, Poland, the Soviet Union, and of course, Germany. And in many ways, it's again here with the memorial also to the murdered Jews of Europe, in Berlin, the case that the very term Europe itself, I think, kind of focuses the lens on geographically in a particular way. Now, I think that has not always been that way, and I think that's important for us to remember. I'm giving you here one very early visualization of the Holocaust, that to this day you could see in north of Israel in the Ghetto Fighter Museum. This is a display from the 1950s. This is just one selection out of a larger kind of European-wide map. But that map that was used in the 1950s, as you can see, still has North Africa and the camps there as well. And then, of course, if we swing back to Yad Vashem and to the memorials of the destroyed communities, then we also start to understand that here in this kind of memorial landscape, there's a wider, more inclusive tendency. So then we have to think about, obviously the history of the Holocaust needs to be as inclusive as it should be. But I think we also have to think about, is there something that we can learn about the Holocaust that we wouldn't have noticed otherwise, or that we would have left out more easily by, in other words, not including the Sephardim? In other words, my question is it just a question of bringing in the Sephardic Jews into the Holocaust? Or if we do that, do we also start to think about the Holocaust in a slightly different way? And I would like to argue that it's the latter, and that in particular, the example of the Sephardim during the Holocaust highlights three different, but equally, I think, interesting topics. For one, it brings up the issue of nation states, and it reminds us of the fact that the geographies of the countries during the Holocaust are not the kind of geographies of today. In other words, Italy had different borders, and so did Greece, and so did Bulgaria. So I think that's quite significant. Secondly, by including the Sephardim, and I've already alluded to this, I think we're changing a little bit the quote unquote the geographies of the Holocaust and become inclusive of a wider realm, in particular if that is not just simply an issue of scale, but more of inclusion, meaning we are more bound to include also victims that come out of the narrower confines of what we describe as Europe. We are all of a sudden mindful of the fact that France was a colonial power, that in lots of ways, when the Germans occupied France, they also occupied and took control of Algeria. We're also mindful that that equally applies to Italy. So I think that's relevant. And then last but not least, and this is in my mind an intriguing case, the issue of the Sephardim, at least from the perspective of the perpetrators, brings up interesting questions, in particular toward the end of the Holocaust, meaning in the 1944, where the very question of who is Sephardic Jews, who are they, what defines them, is one that surprisingly bedevils the Nazi perpetrators. And they invest considerable amount of time into this issue of debating as to whether the Sephardic Jews of Amsterdam are indeed Jewish or not. And now it might seem to you, that in many ways it's a trivial question, but I think it goes to the core of how the Nazis defined Jewishness. And therefore it's quite relevant for us to investigate. All right, then after this kind of opening, let me just therefore talk again about the Sephardic Jews and the Third Reich in three different ways. Once along the lines of these kind of complicated changes of borders and nation states. Secondly, in terms of kind of complicating our geographies of the Holocaust. And then thirdly, in light of what I just talked now about in terms of what it may tell us about what I would call bacteriological version of anti-Semitism that the Nazis had, meaning a very biological understanding of what constitutes Jewishness, which was at the core of the more radical formulation that the Third Reich represented and then implemented in the Holocaust. In other words, it goes toward defining really the nature of what they were aiming to do. Now, this will be no news to you, but I just thought it's an easy way to begin that when we think about the Sephardic Jews, we're obviously thinking about an immensely dispersed community across eventually various nation states. As they left Spain and Portugal, they fanned out across the Mediterranean into North Africa, the Middle East, but also then again upwards into parts of Europe, all the way up to Vienna, and then in the other direction into the south of France, Amsterdam, all the way up to England, as well as up to Hamburg and its further outposts like Glückstadt and the likes. So it's a fairly dispersed geography, which I think explains some of the difficulties that we're sometimes encountering here. But I think here comes right away our very first point that complicates our story when we realize that during the Holocaust, the Bulgarians defended their own Jews and prevented them from being deported and saved them in many ways, but participated in the deportation of those Jews that were part of traditional Greece, but had been annexed to Bulgaria. And you see those territories here in particularly highlighted. In other words, and this is a common aspect of what we're looking at, that during the Holocaust, for as long as Jews still belonged to nation states, that these existing nation states provided some protection. When the states collapsed, or they were, so to speak, outside of their original nation states, they had lesser protection. The extreme example of this would be Poland or the Ukraine, but we see variations of that also on this end with Bulgaria in particular. So that therefore, even though the Germans never really occupied Bulgaria, most of the Jews were safe because the deportations were not carried out as far as the Jews of proper Bulgaria are concerned. But the Jews from Macedonia and Thrace were deported and eventually murdered at Treblinka. This is no different in many ways to the experience of the Jews of Greece, who also in their own ways had a very complicated history in terms of their respective geographies. Thessalonica or Thessaloniki was the second largest center of Sephardic Jewry in the Eastern Mediterranean, and therefore most often stands in as a prime example when we talk about the destruction of Sephardic Jewish communities. They excelled in the production of silk, wool, and other cotton fabrics, and were engaged in a fairly wide-ranging international trade. By the 17th century already, about 30,000 Jews lived in Thessaloniki, and thereby represented a formidable urban center. Salonika, though, became part of Greece in 1913, and then there it started to get really messy with the coloring, and the borders went back and forth, and various parts of Greece were eventually also occupied by Italy. And this is where now our story ends up being more complicated, that in many ways, this blue part initially is part of an Italian occupation zone. So Italy, in lots of ways, uses its alliance with the Third Reich as an opportunity to kind of push out as well. And for as long as Italy is not occupied, neither is Greece. And so that creates part of the very specific dynamic. When Italy collapses and is occupied, then so is eventually Greece, and then the Jews are very quickly and suddenly destroyed and deported en masse now across a very complicated geography, meaning from all the way down here, all the way up across the Balkans, all the way to Auschwitz and Treblinka. Now, at this point, the geography starts to shift a little bit because the death camps themselves by 43 are largely being decommissioned, meaning Treblinka and places like that, whereas Auschwitz becomes larger and larger, and therefore becomes a major site now of the mass destruction, in particular of Sephardic Jews. But what I think is interesting, and again is something that often is absent or is missing, and this is the kind of issue of the borders, is if you look, and this might be too small on your screen, all the way down here to your little arrow, then you start to understand that under these deportations from Greece were also those that had been occupied still by Italy, and therefore they were transported now via Italy to Auschwitz. And so we have this oddity of sorts that amongst the Italian deportation, we find also Greek deportations, meaning Sephardic Jews who are being deported by first being moved to Athens and then moved across to Italy and then deported from Italy onwards. In other words, when we're looking for the Sephardic Jews as victims in the Holocaust, we have to look not just simply in the territories where they're mostly resided, but we also will end up finding further Jewish and Sephardic victims elsewhere. And this, brings out, this visualization that we've developed at the Ackerman Center, where we are looking at the Italian deportations, but we're seeing that the Italian deportations here on the left side include roads and coasts from where Jews are initially deported across, if you follow this yellow, to Athens and Greece, and then from Athens and Greece, if you follow those gray lines, back to Auschwitz. In other words, the routes of deportations for Sephardic Jews follow sometimes more perplexing or confusing lines, which makes it a little bit harder for us sometimes to keep track of them. And here again, you can see that the numbers are not insignificant. This is again within the context of the Italian deportations, that we have a significant number of those who come here, 1,820 from roads and coasts. Let me just, where are we now here? So now let me look at this. So this is, probably the more familiar story to you, and that's why I was very brief. This is the story of the Sephardim, the Balkans, and the Sephardim of Greece, Salonika in particular. And I think what is perplexing there at times are these changing borders of these various nation states that continue to exist, are occupied, not occupied, and so on and so forth. Let me now get to my second point, what I call the geographies of the Holocaust. So here I've already indicated that part of the possible shortcoming is that insofar as we think about the Holocaust as a European event, we focus our attention kind of a little bit more upward north, right? And thereby exclude potentially things that are happened on the southern periphery. Now, I would argue that this part is very significant insofar as we have, when we try to understand something about the Holocaust, what makes the Holocaust unique possibly from other genocides, then I think one of the key elements that is often used in that debate is its scale, the geography. That unlike other genocides, the Armenian genocide as a classical example, the Holocaust was never confined to one particular geography, right? It ultimately expanded and became, engulfed the whole continent of Europe. But I think the kind of absence of limits become nowhere more apparent than when we look at the experience of Sephardic Jews. And that's why I think it's an important case. And it needs for us to return to something which reminds us of the fact that when we look at the Holocaust, we look at it from the hindsight of 45. If we drop back into the year 1942, we will realize very quickly that North Africa mattered a great deal, not only because of Casablanca. This is the image that I use from the movie Casablanca, because if you haven't seen it in a while, let me remind you that at the beginning, you see a spinning globe. And then there's this kind of arrow that comes, goes to Paris and then goes all the way from Paris to Marseille, from Marseille downward toward Casablanca, and exposes really the kind of geographies of the Mediterranean all the way down to North Africa. Now you could say, okay, that's just part of a silly movie, but not quite. In many ways, if we think in particular from the perspective, let's say, of the United States was engaged first and foremost in a battle in the Second World War in the European context early on in North Africa. This is where they were trying together with the British forces to make their push and to force, on the one side, the Nazis out of the northern parts here, in particular out of this geography here, and then to launch from there eventually the attack across the Mediterranean toward Italy. So in lots of ways, from the perspective of the British and of the American forces, this geography was central piece. They were not quite yet thinking about Italy or France or the Normandy or anything. They were very much thinking about this geography. So insofar as we're in 42, I would argue this geography is as central of sorts as the Eastern European geography is. And it also is important to the story that interests us, and that is the story of the Holocaust. This very man, Walter Rauff, was already sitting in the wings, so to speak, in Greece with an assembled killing squad to descend upon North Africa. He was charged to do essentially what the other killing squads had done in Eastern Europe, meaning to operate behind the army lines and to round up village after village and to shoot as many Jews as possibly in these mass shootings that occurred on the East. Now, the Nazis had nothing else in mind for North Africa as well. And in 42, it looked almost as if the Third Reich was maintaining the upper hand, and that Walter Rauff and his units would eventually exert their pressure upon Palestine itself. So that in lots of ways, if we think about the geography of the Holocaust in 1942 up until the beginning of 43, it would have had a much more significant inclusion of the Sephardic Jews. Now, luckily, the British and the American forces were ultimately victorious and pushed out the Third Reich, and the illustrious German general Rommel was not victorious and was pushed back repeatedly in this time zone. So much so that by the beginning of 43, this campaign is largely failed for the Nazis, as much as the Eastern European campaign meaning the attack on Soviet Union, had also started to fail. So there is really something important for us to understand about the Holocaust, I think, here, if we want to understand not ultimately only what it was, but what it could have become. And if we want to understand what it could have become, then this geography of North Africa and its Sephardic communities is far more significant. And it also illustrates, in my mind, that in many ways, the Nazis and their plans had no real geographic limits imposed upon their genocidal policies, but they're entirely dependent really on the success of their armies. All right, let me now then move into my last example of the kind of geographies. This is one of the collaborative efforts that was carried out in France that focuses on the largest deportation from France of July 44. And it tried, to its best of their abilities to identify all of the victims on that deportation. And really to kind of take one deportation, Convoy 77, and to really, identify all of the victims. And when you do that, you come to kind of perplexing realizations that amongst those Jews who are deported here on this Convoy 77 were a good many that had been born in far away places. I know on your screen everything is a little smaller, so I apologize for this. But of the victims of this Convoy 77, there are a good many of them who had been born in Istanbul or in Constantine, in other places, including also, I'm just picking out now some. Here you could see that had been born in Algeria and in Greece and in 20 other places. In other words, what we have to realize is that if we drill into some individual deportations more closely and into the fate of Jews, for example, particularly in France, then we will undoubtedly also find a fairly large and significant number of foreign Jews, meaning without French citizenship, and that of those Jews with foreign passports, undoubtedly there were a good many of Sephardic Jews. But that those normally don't quite come into our picture because they're numerically not significant in the larger scheme of the deportations from a particular country, nor are they part of bounded communities. They're extended families and individuals, but not part of larger communities, and thereby they're most often less visible. But on this deportation from France, Convoy 77, I mean, this is something that we just broke out once. There were 34 that came from Tunis, 9 from Sousse, 2 from Sétif, and so on and so forth. In other words, we see that the geography of victims remains far more complicated, in particular if we are not just solely looking at it through the lens of overall numbers. And if we are not just simply thinking about where did the largest number of Jews die, but if we try to be more inclusive, then we realize that amongst those that are deported from Belgium, from the Netherlands, from France, from Austria, and a good many Italy, and a good many other places, that a good many of those would have included Jews from places elsewhere, and of those, a good number of them would have been Sephardic Jews. All right, let me now come to my last example of why I think the history of Sephardic Jews potentially does not simply mean that we're adding on something without changing what we think about the Holocaust, but possibly makes our understanding of the Holocaust also more interesting, or refines it a little bit more. So there's no doubt that the Third Reich was highly anti-Semitic, but I think what to this day bedevils historians is in what ways was the anti-Semitism of the Third Reich different from any pre-existing forms of anti-Semitism. And the kind of critical moment in this, or one of the critical moments, are the so-called Nuremberg laws of 1935 that define one's Jewishness not through one's confession, meaning whether you believe and you're a part of a synagogue, but entirely through one's descent. And not just through the descents of, respectively of one's parents, but also of respectively one's grandparents. And while that created a kind of very straightforward, or so it seems straightforward, racial definition of Jews, it left a little bit unclear as to how, in particular, the descendants of mixed families would be treated. And this is something that continuously is a big challenge to the Third Reich, but also how indeed cases would be treated where the descendancy is less clearly defined. And if I just repeat the last part one more time more slowly, that one of the big challenges to this racialized view was how to deal with individuals with less clearly defined descendancies. Then you start to understand why possibly the history of Sephardic Jews could be, or the identity of Sephardic Jews could be something that could be perplexing. And this brings us now to Amsterdam, and in a way to this man, Hans-Georg Calmeyer, who comes from Germany. He's a lawyer, learned man with political leanings toward the left. Therefore, he escapes Nazi Germany and moves over to the Netherlands, where he takes on an administrative role that has to deal with those cases of Dutch Jews who appeal to be not considered to be Jewish. So according to the census, there were about a little over 4,000 Sephardic Jews counted in Amsterdam in 1940. And now there are a good many of them that appeal to this office, and they are trying to make a case that in many ways, their own genealogy, meaning their descendancy in terms of their great-grandparents and so on and so forth, in many ways makes them exceptions to the rules of the Nuremberg laws, because there is not this clearly defined descendancy of Jewish grandparents and parents and so on and so forth. And Calmeyer engages now in large-scale research to substantiate these claims. And so this becomes a fairly obvious endeavor in terms of trying to save lives by becoming tremendously, quote unquote, engaged in the process of studying now Sephardic Jews, their birth certificates, their genealogies, and so on and so forth. And for a good many months of the opening time of the Holocaust, that seems to work. So the early deportations from the Netherlands do not include any of these Sephardic Jews, because they're all placed on exception lists. So in lots of ways, therefore, Calmeyer, looking back, has often been elevated into this heroic savior. But then he also, by others, has been seen in a more critical way, because for everyone that he was not able to vindicate in that way, they obviously would be deported. So he, in lots of ways, was placed into a really complicated position himself. But if we leave him aside for a moment, then he's engaged in fairly complicated work. Approximately 5,600 cases were submitted to his office, and of them, 3,700 were spared deportation and certain death. Others, however, ended up in that category and therefore ended up being deported. Nonetheless, despite all these kind of complexities of difficult choices, he was recognized amongst the righteous among the nations. So this is an interesting part about Calmeyer and this particular office. But the more almost or equally interesting question is how the Nazis now dealt with this question. So in 1943, the landscape of the Holocaust starts to change. In the middle of 1943, the Nazis have really realized that they've been pushed out of North Africa. And on the Eastern Front and in the Soviet Union, they are now in a process of at what you could call at best orderly retreat. Not quite yet totally chaotically, but most certainly not assertively any longer moving forward. And it's at this point now where they're making many significant changes. And amongst these changes are, for example, that some of the death camps that had been created for the destruction of Polish Jews are being closed down, while Auschwitz is significantly enlarged to shift, in other words, the geography from the east a bit more to the west. But at the same time, they are now in a sweeping manner revisiting across the European landscape who are they persecuting. And so they are trying now in virtually every one of the occupied countries to assert more radical definitions. So they're rounding up increasing amounts now of individuals who were placed on exception lists because of their economic utility, because they were protected by non-Jewish partners, husbands or wives, or for any other reasons. And so we see this as being something that is in many ways happening in France and happening in Germany, happening in the Netherlands in many ways. But in this process, tied up is now once again this question about the identity of the Sephardic Jews. And there's now this University of Amsterdam that engages in what seems to be the oddest of forms of studies, but they're again photographing and evaluating now Sephardic Jews to come up with a kind of listing of core categories, what constitutes Sephardic Jews, so to be in a position to judge, something about the identity of these little over 4,000 Sephardic Jews. And in this time, Eichmann is briefed on these happenings. So this is something that they really are obsessed about because they're interested in not just destroying communities, they're interested in destroying the last remnants of communities. And they most certainly do not want to leave anyone behind who in their mind could be the beginning of a return of a Jewish culture in the future. So this might strike us as ridiculous, and in many ways it is, but it's a fairly high profile occupation during this period. But for whatever reasons, these various studies conducted by the University of Amsterdam and by the Calmeyer office stall this process of the deportation of the Sephardic Jews up until now the February of 44. Well, once again, Eichmann personally intervenes, and so is Himmler. And we're now, according to this larger file, this is, you can look it up in Yad Vashem, where you have the original documents. Now, all the higher ranking individuals are engaged in this process, and there's quite literally now exams that are carried out in Westerbork, meaning in the transit camp, about these Sephardic Jews, of whom now eventually the better part is at last being deported. When all of a sudden at this very late moment, all of the arguments in favor of these Sephardic Jews as being not Jewish are dismissed and their Jewishness is established precisely at the time when the Nazis are also in other ways applying now more radical definitions of what constitutes Jewishness and are embracing more and more really this idea that what otherwise you could call like the one drop definition, insofar as there's some kind of involvement of some kind of Jewish presence in the families that suffices to constitute the Jewish identity. In other words, they are going, and this is my point, they're going far beyond what they had described in the Nuremberg laws of 1935. So they're radicalizing here, and we are getting a very clear sense of that radicalization, ironically, not by looking at so much at the Ashkenazic Jews, but by looking at the fate of the Sephardic Jews. And that, I think, brings me to the end of my presentation. And I want to thank you for your attention. And like Cindy already said, we have still a little bit of time to hang out here together and hopefully discuss these things a little bit further. So I'm going to stop now sharing my screen. Here I go. And I'm back. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Roemer. We do have some questions in the chat. Did you want to scroll back through and look at them, or do you want me just to read them to you, or what's better for you?
If you don't mind, why don't you pick and choose? You might have been paying more attention. I was like, had my eyes on my PowerPoint and not on the chat function. But
no, absolutely. We did have one that was asking about the deportations of the Italian Jews and whether or not they were mainly being deported from Rome northward. And then while you're talking about the Italian Jews, I'll combine it with another question. There was another question about the Italian Jews, and I'm scrolling to get to it, about whether or not how you're grouping the Italian Jews as Sephardic.
Okay, maybe the last question, this is the easier. I'm not classifying the Italian Jews as Sephardic, but what I was, well, I'm not going to go back to this PowerPoint, but if you look at the Jews that are listed under the Italian deportation, then that includes also 1,800 Jews who came from Greece, and in particular from Rhodes, and that those Jews fall into the category of being Sephardic Jews. And they were just routed through Italy because Italy had occupied early on or annexed these territories. So that's maybe just the technical part, which was part of what I was trying to get at, that these states change. They're kind of doing this period constantly, their forms, because one of the ways by which the Nazis convince other countries to associate themselves with it is that they provide benefits. So Bulgaria is entitled to annex all of a sudden parts from Greece. And so that's all of a sudden what makes them be a little bit more compliant. And so we see this quite a bit in the Balkans, which, however, makes this very confusing, that what is Bulgarian at some point is Greece at another point. As far as the deportations otherwise from Italy are concerned, they're moving them up north, and then from there, they're essentially employing the same method that they do in the Netherlands and Germany, and also in France, that they use the northern camps as transit camps, from which then the Jews are deported onwards to, largely at this point, to Auschwitz. I mean, there are a few also end up in German camps for different reasons. When I mean German camps, I mean camps in the German territory, like Bergen-Belsen or Ravensbrück or Dachau or places like that. But for as long as the camp, Auschwitz is still operational, which is until November 44, they're largely deporting actually in a very rushed manner everyone toward Auschwitz, precisely at the point when Auschwitz is also receiving record numbers of Jewish victims from Hungary. So in lots of ways, Auschwitz is really bursting at its capacities at this point. But that's also when the last remnants of Greek Jews are still being deported throughout 44, as well as from Italy, which says a lot about what matters to the Nazis at this point. Because if you think about otherwise what happens in 44, the Allies are landing in the Normandy already, right? This is already happening. And the Soviets are pushing across, now through Poland, and are already liberating the first camp, the first larger camp, meaning Majdanek, in September. But they, at the same time, keep deporting onwards to Auschwitz for as long as they can, meaning until November.
We have another question. Did the Lyon deportees first get sent to Drancy? I'm not sure if you know that.
Say that again.
From Lyon, L-Y-O-N.
Yes. Most of them were initially sent forward to Drancy, and then from Drancy onward. Now the Lyon deportations are interesting, not unlike the Marseille deportations, because both Lyon and Marseille are essentially harbor cities. So within the vicinity of those deportations from the south, if you look at the actual list, you'll find fairly larger percentage of foreign Jews, meaning Jews who often had moved to the south of France in the 1920s. The south of France, Lyon, Marseille, these became places of opportunities in the 1920s for Jews from the Mediterranean. So you find amongst those that are then deported from, or arrested and then deported onwards from Lyon or Marseille. You find Jews from Egypt, from Lebanon, from Tunisia, and all kinds of places who had crossed the Atlantic in the 1920s in search for opportunities. Not unlike Jews had looked for opportunities by earlier going across the Atlantic to the United States. But in the 1920s, they, thought that they could find their fortune and found their fortune for a while in these harbor cities, where they also were able to make use of their pre-existing networks and trading contacts still with extended families elsewhere. And so we see in particular larger numbers of, let's say, otherwise North African Jews being amongst the ones who are deported, in particular if we're looking at Marseille and Lyon, which makes sense, harbor cities.
We have a question from Dr. Miller. He would like to know what the basis for distinguishing Jewishness and Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews were.
You were breaking out for a moment, Cindy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Dr. Miller asked, what was the basis for distinguishing Jewishness and Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews?
Okay, so when it comes to the Nuremberg definition of what constitutes Jewishness, it's, on the baseline, it's very straightforward. It's not one's culture, it's not one's faith, but it's simply who you were born to. And not just simply whether your parents were Jewish, but also whether your grandparents are Jewish. So that's, in lots of ways, trying to clarify something that becomes actually quite confusing to the Nazis themselves, who to classify according to race as Jewish. And it continues to be a big problem for them all the way down to when they have to assess how many Jews are possibly there to be killed. And you see this being the big problem of the Wannsee conference, that the only data that is available about the number of Jews, let's say in France or in Netherlands, is according to their self-definition along confessional lines, those who belong to synagogues. And so Eichmann works really hard on figuring out what are the numbers according to racial definitions in those countries. When it comes to the Sephardic Jews, the issue largely is not debated. So when it comes to Salonika or to other Sephardic Jews, they are classified as Jews. It just is in these smaller pockets, and Amsterdam is one of those, where this gets debated. But what I found so striking is that it's a debate that is carried out over an extended period of time, over a year, that it involves substantial resources, high-ranking individuals, meaning Eichmann, and continued practice where you still start measuring individuals' foreheads while they're already in transit camps. And so I think it is such a striking case that it kind of goes to the core of how Nazis want to define Jews. And they define them, not, really in a, what is often called the bacteriological way, meaning by their last drop, it is defined, and it's that last drop that defines them and therefore needs to be eradicated. And it's this most radical definition which is increasingly gaining ground. It would have not been possible for them to have it as a consensus in 1935. And we still see Eichmann trying to impose with Heydrich this radical definition in 1941 and in 1942, but yet again they fail. And interestingly enough, this more radical definition gains only more grounds the further the end of the Third Reich is in sight, meaning 1943 and 1944.
Okay. Another question is referring to the study you were talking about at the University of Amsterdam. They're asking whether or not any conversos, the descendants of the Sephardim in Spain, were classified as Jews because of the physical characteristics.
Yes, so initially this office can protect a good many by classifying them as non-Jews, and therefore they're exempt from deportation. But then increasingly those exemptions are taken away, and the very last remains of those that are about 400, they are being deported in 1944. So that in the end, all of this is in vain, and kind of keeps them protected or excluded from deportation for so long, but not at the end. So at the end, it's a file where a case where there's really an executive decision coming from high above that says no, they are Jewish and they are to be deported.
Okay, another question.
And it's again, it's interesting. It's one of those parts where we can see where Eichmann can assert himself. And Eichmann has at this point the direct support of the replacement of Heydrich, who had been assassinated, and then that office had remained vacant, but Kaltenbrunner replaces him. And they are all buddies from Salzburg, from Austria. And so Eichmann, therefore, has now the full support of someone who's really close to the highest echelon of the power within the Third Reich. Kaltenbrunner is a trusted individual of Hitler. Kaltenbrunner is the one who was charged to investigate the attempt to assassinate Hitler. So by Eichmann sitting directly under this guy, he all of a sudden from 43 onwards is able to radicalize his program of his office far more than he ever could before.
Okay. Are the Romanoites from Greece considered Sephardim?
Are there, say that again?
Romanoites.
Sabbateans of, I'm not sure. I don't know.
There's a lot of comments. I was going to say there's a lot of comments thanking you, but I also wanted to highlight one in particular from Rochelle Bortnick. She said, as a Sephardic Jew, I offer my deep thanks for treating this subject so thoroughly.
Much appreciated. But I think, and I want to make this point one more time, maybe a bit more forcefully. I think the inclusion of Sephardic Jews into the history of the Holocaust is not just simply an issue of being then more inclusive and more comprehensive. I think it is needed because otherwise, without them, we are too easily locked into a particular geography, the geography of what we could call Central Europe, and we do not understand, something about the potential, ambitions of the Third Reich that went beyond that geography and was, early on very clearly trying to reach into North Africa and even into Palestine as well. So I find it for those reasons critical, but I also find it important, and this is why I included this last kind of odd example about the Sephardic Jews of Amsterdam, and that is, in many ways, when we think about the Holocaust, we think about Hitler coming to power and then having this kind of blueprint in mind and then implementing everything. But I think there are very significant changes that happen still in this period. And one of these changes, I think, have to do with a more radical definition of who's included. And we kind of get a glimpse of that when we see how all of a sudden Jews who have non-Jewish partners are harassed and persecuted in 43 and 44. But I think we also see this in this kind of almost obsession. You think about this empire of the Third Reich, where some of its highest ranking individuals constantly obsess and produce significant paper trails about as to whether these Jews of Amsterdam are indeed, the Sephardic Jews of Amsterdam are against Jewish. And I think for me, at least, when I found that paper trail, it just made me realize that what the Nazis were trying to persecute at this point was not really a reality, but it was a fantasy of sorts that they were trying to get hold of. And that's why they obsessed so much about these definitions of who would be included and who wouldn't be included. Because you would have thought in 44, really, they're losing the war. The Soviets are coming, the Americans are coming, and they're carrying out exams of foreheads in transit camps and report back to Berlin, and Eichmann is studying these and reports back to Himmler, where you think this is an obsession, which says something about this regime, which I think we otherwise often miss.
Thank you. We do have a few more questions, but I think maybe we'll We'll ask one last one, and then just to be respectful of everyone's time on a Sunday afternoon, anyone's more than welcome to contact me directly, and I'm happy to forward questions along. This is going to be recorded, and we'll post it on YouTube, and I'll send that out to everybody. So that was one of the questions in the chat. But finally, Dr. Roemer, could you speak a little to what remains of Jewish life in Greece today?
Well, I think that's, the question with many of these places, Bulgaria being another one, that at this point, in terms of what it once was throughout Europe, there's obviously very little that remains. And then, whatever has remained, I think also has dispersed one more time after 45, which is also very clearly the case for the remaining Jewish communities of North Africa. I mean, in the end, they were large, comparatively speaking. They survived the Second World War, they survived the Holocaust, but they ended up being not surviving the kind of unraveling of the next conflict, which is the Middle Eastern conflict. And so I think that, brings then, unfortunately, in different ways, the end to these communities. For us, I think it's more of a question of recognizing that these communities existed and also need to be included much more than they have in the ways in which we think about the Holocaust. And again, my biggest bone of contention is the way by which we impose our post-war geographies upon the Second World War geography, and we are excluding thereby, in particular, this much more fluid boundary between Europe and the Mediterranean and the islands and North Africa, where I think in particular, it's in that overlap where many of the Sephardic communities actually existed. And we have trouble seeing them if we think about Europe through the lens of today's European Union. And we're like doing that a little bit. And I think we're hurting ourselves quite a bit and missing a really important aspect of this. Otherwise, I invite you all to watch Casablanca, which is entertaining in many other ways, and has a really interesting point to make, that the geography of that time is still a very different one, and that the last place to escape, interestingly, is Lisbon, which is one of the kind of interesting moments there as well. But it shows you how, for example, refugees from Marseille would have had to escape in order to jump Spain via North Africa. So if you were stuck in the south of France in 1939, 1940, and you wanted to get out of there, well, you had the illegal crossing of the Pyrenees as one option, but that was not the most desirable. But there are a good many of Jewish refugees make it actually out of Europe from Marseille via North Africa, and then to Lisbon, and then across the Atlantic. So I think there's a lot that we're missing, really, to say it again, by having a too narrow of a sense of what Europe was during that period of time. Let me use this again to thank you all for your enthusiasm of having stayed with me for the entire duration, and of being such good sports about it. And also let me welcome you whenever you have a chance, and follow us on Facebook and our websites about our many events. We've been lecturing online for the last, 8-9 months, ever since we went into the pandemic, quite extensively. And unfortunately, as you will all know, the pandemic is still with us, and I therefore expect us to continue to do quite a bit of that as we go forward. So wherever you are, I think unfortunately you're facing some of the very same challenges of staying safe and staying healthy. Just keep doing whatever you've been doing, and then hopefully we'll all be at some point in a better part again of ourselves at some point in 21. So thank you all again for having joined me today. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you again for organizing this.
Lots of thank yous in the comments.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
so much.
Trying to hang up.
Thank you.
Very enlightening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Trying to hang up.
Thank you
John is
much.
there.
I'd like to answer the question about the Romagnots and the Sabbateans, if possible.
Yeah,
for
go
whoever
ahead,
is
answer
left.
the question. You want to answer
in
the
Greece,
question. Yes,
the Sabbateans were the ones, yes, were the ones who had converted to Islam. And luckily, they had been transported to Turkey as Muslims in the population exchange between Turkey and Greece. So they saved themselves. Had they stayed in Greece, they would have been deported as Jews. But their that exchange of so-called exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey saved their lives. Really, they were sent to Turkey. And the other one was about the Romagnots. The Romagnots are the Greek-speaking Jews.
Right.
That are not Sephardic, but were also in Greece, in cities like Yanina in the north. And they were absolutely transported to Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for adding this.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
I can add something to that about.
Why don't you?
Okay. The Jews of Athens were rescued by the Spanish, partly were rescued by the Spanish ambassador, Radicalization was his name. Those with Spanish names were given Spanish citizenship. I met a Jew from there who had the same last name I have, and I asked how he escaped the Holocaust, and he mentioned that he was given Spanish citizenship. I have another friend, a Greek Jew from Athens, and he was hiding. I asked him why he wasn't rescued as a Sephardic. He says, because I have a Greek name. He was a Romagnot. But if he had had a Spanish name, he would have had Spanish citizenship and escaped.
But many with Spanish names were also deported.
I'm glad, though, that you're bringing this up, because this is another one of these kind of confusing and perplexing moments, in particular in 44, where the Third Reich, reaches out to Turkey and to Spain and a good many of the other neutral countries and suggests for them to save their Jews and to take them back. But unfortunately, a good number of countries, including Turkey, are not really protecting their own. And again, this results in then their deportation. And amongst them are a good many of Jews who were born in Istanbul, meaning largely Sephardic Jews who are therefore being deported. So the histories are very complex. Turkey, some of the Turkish embassies do a very good job in trying to protect Turkish citizens. Ankara does not do a good job. And so that's, and Spain's record is also a little bit half and half of sorts. And so that's where it gets, unfortunately, very confusing sometimes.
The council, the Turkish council in Rhodes helped the Jews.
That's
and he is part of the righteous in Yad Vashem.
That's absolutely right. But Ankara is less helpful during that time.
Absolutely, they did nothing.
Exactly.
Can I ask a question, please? I'm the one that asked the question about the Romagnots, and I wanted to know. I know people from our ancestors are from Yemen, and they came over to the United States, and there was a synagogue down in New York City.
There is still.
Yes, there is one. And but my question was, I don't know what their traditions are. Are they Sephardic? Are they Ashkenazi? Or they have their own? Are they a different?
They have their own. They have their own. It's a Greek. It's a Romagnot rite. They have their own, and you can visit their synagogue in New York and see it in action. It's the only one existing. Yes.
And the Romania Jews also in small numbers had migrated to Italy. So amongst the Italian Jews, you also have some of the Romaniots that have their own nusach and their own customs, and remain quite distinct.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
very much. This was
Thank you all.
wonderful. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you again for having me here.
Thank you.
I'm gonna sign off then. Bye, Cindy, and
And
thank you
bye-bye.
again. We'll talk Monday,
Thanks
okay?
again.
Yes.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Dr.
Bye,
Roemer.
everyone.
And
Bye.
thank you, Rochelle, for that. Are
Good
you in
question.
Dallas right now, Rochelle?
Yes, of course. Where else can I be?
Oh, I know, we don't travel too much, but
At home.
at home, yes.
Cindy, I just finished a big Zoom session for the University of Washington.
Did you?
On Ladino.
I
I'll
have
send
my,
you the link.
you see what I have? You told me to get it and I
Good
did.
for you. Good for you. Good for you.
Yeah, I was watching your Zoom section on the Ladino, so I missed the first half of this one, but I'm anxious to watch the recording on YouTube.
We'll
And I guess
definitely get that out.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all very much and stay safe and hopefully we'll have a chance to do this again soon.
And happy Hanukkah, everybody.
Yes.
Okay.